Imagine moving into your dream home, a sprawling 14-room farmhouse steeped in history and surrounded by the quiet beauty of the countryside. For the Perron family in 1971, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where Roger, Carolyn and their 5 daughters could build a lifetime of happy memories. But the house held dark secrets, a chilling history of tragedy and death that would soon come alive in ways they could never have imagined. What began as small, peculiar disturbances quickly escalated into a full-blown nightmare, leaving the family trapped in a battle against unseen forces. This is the haunting true story of the Perron family, the sinister events that inspired the Conjuring, and the unimaginable horror they endured in their fight for survival. Welcome to Sinister Secrets, where we uncover the most chilling true stories of the paranormal and unexplained. In today's episode, we explore the harrowing tale of the Perron family haunting, the terrifying real-life events that inspired the horror classic The Conjuring. What began as a hopeful move into a historic farmhouse in the countryside quickly unraveled into a living nightmare. For the Perron family, parents Carolyn and Roger and their 5 daughters Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy and April, it became a relentless struggle against malevolent spirits, violent encounters, and a darkness that seemed determined to tear them apart. This is their story, a battle for survival against forces far beyond our understanding. At first, the strange happenings were so subtle, they almost seemed trivial, easy to explain away. Carolyn, the family's matriarch, often found herself searching for her broom, only to discover it in peculiar places she was certain she hadn't left it. Freshly cleaned floors would mysteriously become littered with small piles of dirt as if mocking her meticulous efforts. Lights flickered, doors creaked open, and the family chuckled, attributing these oddities to the quirks of their charming but aging farmhouse. Carolyn's husband Roger, a pragmatic man, reassured everyone that the house was simply settling after decades of use. The Perron children too were enchanted by their new home at first. The sprawling property, with its wide-open fields and historic charm, seemed like a perfect place for childhood adventures. Andrea, the eldest, relished the opportunity to explore, while little April, the youngest, delighted in her newfound imaginary friend. The house became a playground for the sisters, but even their laughter couldn't mask the faint unease that seemed to linger in the air. Soon, however, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Carolyn noticed that certain rooms felt colder than others, no matter the season. The children started to whisper about shadows that moved on their own, or figures glimpsed from the corners of their eyes. Cindy, always the most sensitive of the girls, refused to sleep in her room, saying she could hear voices calling her name at night. April's conversations with her imaginary friend took on a darker tone, with her describing him as sad and warning her not to go into certain parts of the house. Roger, ever the skeptic, tried to calm the growing unease in the family. He worked tirelessly to fix creaking doors and patch up drafts, insisting there was a logical explanation for everything. But as the incidents grew more frequent and intense, even he couldn't ignore the oppressive energy that seemed to consume the house. It was as though an invisible presence had awakened and was slowly making itself known. The Perrons soon realized they weren't alone in their home. What had once been a dream of a fresh start for their family became a nightmare, one they were powerless to escape. The playful quirks of the house transformed into something much darker, much more sinister, a force that would test their bond as a family and their understanding of the world around them. The atmosphere in the house soon shifted from peculiar to unsettling. Certain rooms seemed to carry a deep chill, no matter how warm the weather outside. There was an oppressive stillness, a sense that the air itself was almost alive. The children began to mention the feeling of being watched, especially when they ventured into the darker corners of the house. Whispers and faint footsteps echoed through the halls at night, sounds that couldn't be explained. Then came the sightings. It started with glimpses, fleeting shapes at the edge of their vision, shadows moving where no one stood. As the weeks passed, these manifestations grew clearer. The Perron daughters began describing spirits with eerie consistency. Some appeared harmless, almost melancholy, as if they were trapped remnants of the past. But one spirit stood apart, a force of pure malevolence that seemed to thrive on fear. This presence was unlike the others. When it was near, the air grew cold and suffocating, and a deep sense of dread filled the room. Carolyn was the first to connect this presence to Bathsheba Sherman, a woman who had lived on the property during the mid-1800s. Bathsheba's life was steeped in sinister lore. Locals whispered that she had been a practitioner of satanic rituals and accused her of causing the death of a neighbor's child. Although never convicted, the rumors persisted, painting Bathsheba as a woman shrouded in darkness. Carolyn became convinced that Bathsheba's spirit lingered in the house and that she resented their intrusion. It was as if Bathsheba saw herself as the rightful mistress of the farmhouse and viewed Carolyn as a threat. The signs of her wrath became harder to ignore: foul odors that appeared and disappeared without explanation, bruises that formed on Carolyn's body overnight, and an oppressive presence that seemed to fixate on her. What had begun as a dream of a fresh start for the Perron family was rapidly descending into a nightmare. The house, once a symbol of hope, had become a battleground for their sanity and safety, with an unseen enemy whose hatred grew stronger with each passing day. The haunting escalated with each passing month, unraveling the Perron family's sense of peace and security. What had once been a house filled with the sounds of a bustling family now echoed with something far more sinister. Doors slammed shut with violent force as though an unseen hand was expressing anger. The heavy thuds of knocking reverberated through the walls at all hours, coming from places no one could pinpoint. Foul odors, sickly, sweet, and rotting, would drift through the air without warning or apparent source, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. These smells became a harbinger, an indication that something unseen and malevolent was nearby. The basement was the heart of the house's terror, a place so foreboding that none of the Perron children dared to venture there unless absolutely necessary. The darkness in the basement was unlike any other, dense, almost tangible, as if it clung to the walls and filled the air with its oppressive weight. Even with the dim glow of a single bulb or the faint beam of a flashlight, the shadows seemed to press in, consuming every corner. The cold was constant, biting and unyielding, as though the basement existed in its own separate, unwelcoming realm. The children often whispered about the strange feeling that lingered there, a sinister energy that seemed to radiate from the cold stone floors and the damp, shadowed corners. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond their sight, waiting. The air itself felt alive, thick and uninviting, heavy with the weight of something unseen. To the Perrons, the basement wasn't just part of their house. It was the center of the darkness that seemed to consume their home, the place where the secrets of the land and its tragic history weighed heaviest. For Carolyn, the matriarch of the family, the basement became a personal battleground. The malevolent presence in the house seemed to fixate on her, its relentless attention eroding her physically and emotionally. It began with bruises, dark, perfectly round marks that appeared overnight. They looked like handprints, as if she had been gripped or struck by an invisible force. No matter how much she tried to rationalize their appearance, there was no logical explanation. Her family watched in horror as the bruises grew more frequent and darker, spreading across her arms and legs, leaving her in constant pain. The toll on Carolyn's body was matched only by the toll on her spirit. Once a vibrant and optimistic woman, she began to wither before her family's eyes. Exhaustion took over as sleepless nights piled one on top of the other. She often wandered the house at night, clutching a rosary and whispering prayers for protection. Her face grew pale, her eyes hollow with despair. She became withdrawn, speaking less and isolating herself from her loved ones. The haunting seemed to have taken root within her, draining her energy and feeding off her anguish, leaving her a shell of the woman she once was. Desperation drove Carolyn to seek answers. She began researching the history of the farmhouse, hoping to uncover something that could explain the horrors her family was enduring. What she found only deepened her sense of dread. The property, she discovered, had been home to 8 generations of the same family. Its history was steeped in tragedy. Stories of suicides, drownings, and murders littered the records. Each event added another layer of darkness to the land, as if the pain and suffering of the past had seeped into the very soil, embedding itself into the foundation of the house. Among the many grim tales, one name stood out above the rest: Bathsheba Sherman. A woman who had lived on the property during the 19th century, Bathsheba's life was shrouded in infamy. Local legends painted her as a practitioner of witchcraft, a woman who had made a pact with the devil himself. The most chilling story claimed that Bathsheba had sacrificed a neighbor's infant in a satanic ritual, piercing the child's skull with a sewing needle. Though she was never convicted of the crime, the whispers of her dark deeds never faded. Her death, too, was cloaked in mystery. Some claimed she took her own life, hanging herself on the property, while others believed she succumbed to a curse of her own making. The deeper Carolyn delved into Bathsheba's story, the more convinced she became that her spirit was at the heart of the torment her family was experiencing. Bathsheba's malevolence seemed to reach across the decades, targeting Carolyn with an almost personal vendetta. Carolyn believed that Bathsheba viewed herself as the true mistress of the house, and that she saw Carolyn as an interloper, a threat to her claim over the property. It was a chilling realization. They weren't just living in a haunted house. They were under attack by a vengeful spirit whose hatred knew no bounds. With each new revelation, Carolyn felt the weight of the house's history pressing down on her. The farmhouse was more than just a home. It was a battleground for forces she could neither see nor fully understand. The knowledge of Bathsheba's dark legacy only confirmed what she already feared. The entity in the house wasn't going to let them go without a fight. By 1973, the Perrons were utterly drained. The relentless onslaught of unexplainable events had pushed them to their physical and emotional limits. Carolyn, already bearing the brunt of the haunting, was deteriorating rapidly. The mysterious bruises on her body grew darker and more frequent, and her vibrant personality had been replaced by a hollow, haunted demeanor. She hardly slept, pacing the house at night and clutching a rosary, praying for an end to their suffering. Her family watched helplessly as the house seemed to consume her, feeding on her energy and despair. Roger, once the rock of the family, was no longer able to mask his frustration and fear. He had tried everything, repairing broken locks, nailing down doors and burning sage, but nothing stopped the chaos that consumed their home. The children, once playful and full of life, became withdrawn, their innocence eroded by the horrors they had witnessed. The once bustling farmhouse had become a battlefield, with the family trapped in the crossfire of an unseen force. Desperate for relief, the Perrons turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren, a couple renowned for their work with the paranormal. Known for their investigation of haunted locations across the country, the Warrens were their last hope. Carolyn, though skeptical, clung to the possibility that the Warrens might hold the key to ending their nightmare. When Ed and Lorraine arrived at the farmhouse, Lorraine, a gifted clairvoyant, immediately sensed the oppressive energy that filled the space. It wasn't just a haunted house, she explained. It was a site of concentrated malevolence. The energy seemed to ooze from the walls, saturating every corner of the house with a sinister heaviness. Lorraine described the presence as dark, angry, and deeply rooted in the property. She warned the family that they were in serious danger, particularly Carolyn, who appeared to be the focus of the entity's wrath. Bathsheba's spirit, Lorraine explained, was not just lingering. It was actively seeking to harm. The Warrens proposed a bold and dangerous plan, a séance to directly confront the spirits and uncover the root of the torment. It was a proposition that carried great risk. Séances could provoke malevolent entities, sometimes escalating activity rather than quelling it. But the Perrons were desperate, their resolve eroded by years of fear and suffering. Carolyn, despite her overwhelming terror, agreed. She had to know why her family was being targeted, and above all, she needed to find a way to make it stop. Desperation had stripped away any hesitation, leaving them willing to try anything to reclaim their lives. The séance was set, and as the Warrens prepared, the Perrons clung to a fragile hope that this final act might end their nightmare. What followed, however, was far beyond what any of them could have imagined. Terrifying encounter that would leave scars on their lives and confirm their worst fears. The battle with Bathsheba was far from over. The night of the séance arrived, and the tension in the house was palpable. The dining room was chosen for its central location, a place where much of the unexplained activity had occurred. The lights were dimmed, and the Warrens set up their equipment while murmuring prayers of protection. The family gathered around the table, their faces pale and tight with fear. Lorraine placed a series of objects on the table, candles, a crucifix, and a rosary, and began the ritual. Her voice was calm but firm as she spoke, reaching out to the spirits that lurked in the shadows of the house. At first, the room was eerily quiet. The only sound was the faint crackle of the candles and the unsteady breathing of those present. The air seemed unnaturally heavy, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. As the minutes dragged on, the stillness became oppressive, a suffocating silence that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Just when the tension felt unbearable, the temperature dropped abruptly. The warmth of the candles was no longer enough to counter the icy chill that swept through the space. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, a bone-deep freeze that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The Perrons shivered, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Lorraine paused, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed something approaching.
"It's here,"
she whispered. The words hung in the air, making everyone's stomachs tighten with dread. As Lorraine continued to call out to the spirits, the atmosphere became electric, as if the air itself was charged with energy. The candles flickered erratically, their flames bending and dancing in response to an unseen force. Then, without warning, a faint knock echoed from somewhere in the house. It was followed by another, louder this time, and then a series of rapid, violent bangs that seemed to come from all directions. The room trembled slightly, the table vibrating under their hands. Carolyn began to shift uncomfortably in her chair. Her breathing grew shallow and laboured, her chest heaving as if the very act of drawing air was a struggle. Her posture stiffened, and she gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The family watched helplessly as her expression began to change. The fear in her eyes was replaced by something darker, more alien. Her face twisted into a grimace of pain and fury, her features contorting in ways that seemed almost inhuman. Then she began to murmur, her voice barely audible at first, a low rumble that grew louder with each passing moment. The words she spoke were guttural, harsh, and completely unrecognizable. It wasn't a language anyone had ever heard, but it carried an unsettling, almost primal weight. The sounds filled the room, resonating in their ears and sending chills down their spines. It was as though another presence was speaking through her, using her body as its vessel. Lorraine's eyes darted to Carolyn, her expression grave.
"Something's taken hold of her,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Roger moved to his wife's side, gripping her shoulders in an attempt to steady her, but Carolyn didn't seem to notice. Her head jerked back violently, and her body began to tremble. The guttural murmurs shifted into a guttural wail, a sound so unnatural it made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. Carolyn's fingers clawed at the table, her nails scraping against the wood with a grating sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. The family sat frozen, unable to look away, as Carolyn's body began to contort. Her movements were jerky and unnatural, her spine arching at impossible angles, as though she were a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. It was no longer just Carolyn at the table, it was something else, something dark and unfathomable, using her as a medium to make its presence known. Her body twisted violently, her spine arching in unnatural ways that seemed to defy the limits of human anatomy. Her head snapped back, her mouth opening wide in a scream that wasn't hers, a sound guttural and primal, echoing with a chilling resonance that froze everyone in the room. The atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very air was being pulled into some unseen vortex. Carolyn's hands clawed at the air, her fingers curling into grotesque shapes, as though she were trying to fend off something no one else could see. Suddenly, as if seized by an invisible force, Carolyn was ripped from her chair. Her body lifted effortlessly into the air, her limbs dangling as though she were a puppet on strings. Then, in a horrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she was hurled across the room with a force so violent that the sound of her impact against the floor reverberated like a thunderclap. The family screamed, their cries mingling with the otherworldly wails pouring from Carolyn's lips. She convulsed on the floor, her body writhing uncontrollably, her eyes wide open but vacant, staring into a void that none of them could comprehend. Roger, paralyzed for a moment by sheer terror, finally broke free from his shock. His voice cracked as he shouted, his fear morphing into desperation. He rushed to Carolyn's side, his hands trembling as he tried to hold her still. But her body continued to thrash violently beneath his grip. Turning to the Warrens, his voice was raw as he demanded they stop the séance. "Get out! Get out of my house!" he roared, his fury barely masking his terror. Lorraine, her face pale and drawn, immediately ended the session, realizing the situation had spiraled far beyond control. Carolyn's body eventually stilled, but she was left trembling and gasping for air, her skin pale and clammy. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, as though she had just emerged from drowning. Roger cradled her in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he begged her to respond. She didn't speak. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped, and her eyes remained distant, as if she were still trapped in the grip of whatever malevolent force had taken hold of her. The Warrens, shaken by the sheer intensity of what had transpired, quickly gathered their equipment and left the house that night. Lorraine, her voice hushed, apologized to Roger and assured him they would pray for his family. But the damage had already been done. The séance had not provided the answers the Perrons were searching for. Instead, it seemed to have unleashed something even darker, more powerful than they could have ever imagined. In the days following the séance, the house seemed to come alive with a fury that defied comprehension. It was as if the spirits had been provoked, their anger boiling over in a relentless assault on the Perron family. Doors didn't just slam anymore, they were flung open with such violence that the sound reverberated through the house like gunshots. Windows rattled in their frames, and objects were hurled across rooms, narrowly missing terrified family members. The shadowy figures that once lingered on the periphery now roamed the house openly, their forms darker and more defined, their movements deliberate and menacing. The nights became unbearable. The relentless pounding on the walls grew louder and more rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through the structure of the house itself. The foul odours intensified, saturating the air with the stench of sulphur and rotting flesh. The family could taste the decay in their mouths, and the smell clung to their skin and clothes as though the malevolent force was marking them. The children, already frightened, became utterly consumed by terror. They whispered of spirits standing at the foot of their beds, watching them with hollow eyes. Cindy began wandering the house in her sleep, her movements stiff and robotic, her face devoid of emotion. She would wake up in the basement or in dark corners of the house, sobbing and unable to remember how she had gotten there. April, the youngest, spoke often of her imaginary friend, Oliver. What began as innocent conversations grew disturbing as April started relaying chilling messages from her friend. She described Oliver as a boy who had died in the house and claimed he warned her to be careful of the woman. The basement became an abyss of dread. No one dared go down there. Not even Roger, who had once prided himself on his skepticism. Growls emanated from the depths, low and guttural, like an animal prowling just out of sight. Shadows moved along the walls as though alive, and the temperature in the basement was always unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer. For the Perrons, the house was no longer just a place to live, it was a battlefield, and they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see or comprehend. The haunting had transformed from an eerie series of events into a full-blown siege, leaving the family in a constant state of fear and exhaustion. The séance had opened a door they could not close, and the malevolent entity on the other side had no intention of letting them go. Carolyn's condition spiraled into something truly horrifying. The bruises that had initially appeared sporadically on her arms and legs began to spread, darkening into deep, almost black marks that resembled handprints, as though invisible forces had gripped her with unrelenting cruelty. No matter how much she tried to hide them, her family could see her pain and her fear. Her once lively demeanour, the warmth and light she brought to their home, had vanished entirely. Carolyn was a shadow of her former self, her spirit seemingly extinguished by the constant torment. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. At night she wandered the house aimlessly, clutching a rosary, muttering prayers under her breath, her voice shaking with desperation. The sound of her pacing became a haunting rhythm that echoed through the halls, a stark reminder that there was no peace to be found within those walls. Sometimes she would stop and stare into the darkness, as if something unseen was staring back at her. Her pleas to the entity, begging it to leave her family alone, were met with silence, or worse, with intensifying disturbances. Roger, once a strong and steady presence in their lives, was reduced to a man consumed by frustration and helplessness. He tried everything to protect his family, but nothing worked. The house seemed to feed on his anger, twisting it into something volatile and destructive. Every slammed door, every whispered taunt from the shadows, felt like a personal attack, a reminder that he could not shield the people he loved most. The tension within the family grew as Roger's helplessness turned to rage and Carolyn's isolation deepened. The house was no longer just their home, it was their prison, and the malevolent force within it their relentless jailer. Leaving was impossible. Financially, they were trapped, unable to afford a new place to live. Emotionally, they were paralyzed by fear, their resolve eroded by the unending torment. They sought help from anyone who would listen, local priests, spiritualists, even skeptical neighbors. But no blessing, prayer, or ritual could cleanse the house of its darkness. Instead, the activity only seemed to escalate, as though the house itself was mocking their attempts to drive it out. Every day was a grueling test of endurance. Doors slammed shut with violent force, objects flew across the room with no warning, and the oppressive atmosphere of the house weighed on them constantly. Nights were worse. The sounds of disembodied footsteps and faint mocking whispers filled the air, while cold spots and inexplicable chills followed them wherever they went. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, creeping along the walls like living things. For the Perrons, there was no escape. The haunting was no longer an occurrence, it was their reality. Years crawled by before they finally left the farmhouse. When they packed their belongings and drove away for the last time, it wasn't with a sense of triumph or relief, but with hearts heavy with grief and exhaustion. The house had taken something from each of them that could never be replaced. Though they left its walls behind, the experiences followed them like a curse. Carolyn's bruises faded, but the emotional scars they all carried ran far deeper. The memories of their time in that house lingered like a shadow, haunting their thoughts and their dreams. For the Perrons, the Harrisville farmhouse became a chapter they could not escape, a defining moment that reshaped their lives. It wasn't just the events that terrorized them, but the profound sense of helplessness, the confrontation with forces that defied logic and faith. The haunting tested their resilience, their relationships, and their understanding of the world around them. Though they survived, they were never the same. The farmhouse still stands, its silent walls holding the echoes of the Perron's torment. Locals speak of its dark history, but few dare approach it. For the Perrons, it remains a place they will never return to, a nightmare they left behind but can never truly forget. Their story endures, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that can invade our lives, and a testament to the resilience of those who dare to endure them. As we close the chapter on the Perron family haunting, let's not forget the courage of those who endured the unimaginable, the fear, the anguish, and the questions that still haunt their lives. Their story is more than just the inspiration for The Conjuring. It's a chilling reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown, a veil we peel back here on Sinister Secrets. If you're new to the channel, welcome to a community unafraid to delve into the eerie, the unexplained, and the darkest corners of true crime and paranormal history. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us as we unravel mysteries that send shivers down your spine. For those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support keeps these haunting tales alive. Together we uncover truths, confront fears, and share in the search for understanding. I'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's story in the comments below. Do you believe the Perron family's haunting was real? Or could there be another explanation? Share your theories, personal experiences, or suggestions for future episodes. We thrive on your input and can't wait to hear from you. Until next time, stay alert, stay wary, and whatever you do, don't turn off the lights. Because the true horrors aren't confined to the screen. They're the unseen whispers lurking in the darkness. Thank you for watching Sinister Secrets, where we delve into the shadows and uncover the terror that lies within.